So we're taking a look at the environment that policy is made in. We took a look at democracy and direct democracy and representative democracy, and whether or not elections themselves actually make any strong policy signals. Let's take a look at some other organizations that might have some influence over public policy in the United States and specific issues. One of the things we take a look at is political parties. And as umbrella groups in the United States, they provide a package of issues that people can vote for. And the good thing that we see here is up in the left-hand corner, that we see that in the United States, most Americans see that there is an important difference between what the Democrats and the Republican parties stand for. Generally, people understand that for the most part, the Democrats are the more liberal party and the Republicans are the more conservative party. But beyond that, perhaps we see that the parties as they're constructed right now don't necessarily really provide what the people are looking for. So while they may vote for the Democrat or Republican candidates, they aren't very happy with what these parties are actually doing as far as individual policies are concerned. So if you take a look at the most recent data related to President Trump and party approval ratings, which is in the upper right-hand corner, what you'll see is that while President Trump may be fairly disliked by the American public, members of Congress are even more disliked. So his approval rating is 39%. Approval rating for Speaker of the House Paul Ryan is only 31%. Republicans in Congress only get 22%, and Democrats in Congress 35%. So ironically, Republicans in Congress are actually more disapproved of than the president himself, and Democrats are equally as unliked. So they're selling something that people just aren't generally buying, and you can see that again down at the bottom left-hand corner. You think the country would be better off if Republicans controlled Congress, if Democrats controlled Congress, or would the country be the same regardless of which party controlled Congress? And what you'll see is there's a steady stream there of somewhere between a third and close to half of people say it's the same between both of them. In other words, there really isn't going to be any policy difference between the two different parties, regardless of who controls Congress. Now, part of this really is because of our separation of powers and gridlock and so forth, but it also has something to say about what people think about the two political parties and what they stand for. And interestingly, these are only asked every couple of years, but I would hazard to guess that probably nothing has really changed here since 2014. And you can really see that by the bottom right-hand corner, Americans' views on the need for a third party. In your view, do the Republicans and Democratic parties do an adequate job of representing the American people, or do they do such a poor job that a third major party is needed? And what you'll see is that there have been some points in time recently in which people have been satisfied with the parties that they're offered. And notably, they've been during an election period. So you see in 2008 and also again in 2012 during presidential elections, people thought the parties offered a pretty good choice. But now in 2016, 57% of people say a third party is needed. So you're getting close to 3/5 of the American people say the parties are not doing a good enough job right now. So parties, difficult really to see whether or not they offer any signals here. The other thing that we can take a look at is so one of the things that we have the problem with when it comes to political parties and policies is that we have relatively weak parties in the United States. And what that means is that there is no way for the political parties really to control politicians. And the primary reason why this is the case is our election system and how we choose people, how they get chosen by their political parties. So in the US, starting around the early 1900s, we had a movement to create a primary system. And that was designed to take power away from the proverbial smoke-filled rooms where political party bosses would be the ones that determined who would represent the parties in the general elections. And because of corruption, both corporate corruption with the parties and also party corruption themselves, The progressive movement really tried to take the power away from these institutions and give it to the people. So with the advent of the political primary process, where individuals or voters and citizens chose who would represent their party in the fall, all of a sudden party officials didn't have the ability to be able to control who was the nominee. Rather, it was a majority of those people that voted, or in some cases, if there were multiple candidates, three or more, plurality would win. So the problem with that is that political parties stand for something in this country, but who you are as an individual is basically determined by the package of ideas that you adopt from your political party. And so I can be a relatively moderate Republican that might represent a state like Massachusetts, and I'm going to be a far different Republican than I would be if I represented a state like Texas. On the other hand, there are still some around Southern conservative Democrats, which would be very different than, say, for example, from urban areas on the coasts. Now, the problem here is not that we have a great diversity, but the problem is that parties find it very difficult to enforce order on the people that are voting. So, for example, as we've seen in recent days and recently in the attempts to be able to repeal Obamacare and replace it with another Republican-led program, what we've seen is that leaders in the House and the Senate for the Republican Party have not been able to marshal a majority of votes to be able to change this, because it's up to the individual member of Congress to decide what they're going to vote for or what they're not going to vote for, because they run on their own. They may have the R or the D behind their names, but it really, the package of issues that they support is up to them and the way that they think their district would like. So really in the US, what we see is that with our party system, parties provide services to candidates. In other words, they help them get elected. They provide them with briefing books. But once they're actually in office, there's no way to control individuals in office because of the political primary system. Now, one of the things that we want to look at is the idea of interest groups in American politics. So if political parties can't kind of solve this riddle of triggers for individual political policies, how about interest groups? Interest groups get kind of a bad rap in American democracy because we think of them in terms of special interests, but they do serve some legitimate purposes in a democracy. So they help clarify and articulate what individuals want. So, for example, most of us don't have the time or the inclination to be able to follow exactly what's going on in government. The interest groups provide us with information. They know what we kind of want to stand for, and then they provide policy positions on that. They help to monitor governance as well. Again, if you've ever been a member of an interest group or belong to an organization, they monitor what's going on in government on a day-to-day basis, and then they contact individuals via email or other sources of information purposes, and they tell us what's going on in government and that we should contact our public officials. Another thing that they do, and this is one of the things that we'll take a look at more in the second half of the semester, is interactive problem solving. So essentially, a lot of what goes on in the bureaucracy is interest groups sit down with other interest groups and the bureaucrats, and they help to negotiate rules. And they try to find something that will work for everybody, and these negotiated regulations are a very important part of what interest groups do. And then finally, coalition building. So what you'll see is that interest groups will work with public officials to be able to build coalitions that are large enough to pass important legislation. So for example, when it comes to things like transportation, you'll have key members of Congress that are on important transportation subcommittees that will work with the interest groups to find out what they want, and they'll try to hammer out some legislation that everybody can support, and then they'll move that forward. Now, what are the sources of interest group influence? First and foremost is if you have the ability to be able to deliver the vote of your constituents, of your interest group, it's a very powerful force for people in Congress standing up and taking notice of your policy positions. Probably the most notable of the groups are the National Rifle Association and the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, because older people vote and people that are gun rights, Second Amendment supporters vote as well. And people try to avoid getting on the wrong side of these two organizations. Now, a second thing that's important is campaign funding. So if interest groups line up behind specific candidates and ask their membership to fund those people, they can provide money to the campaigns. If you're interested, you can go to opensecrets.org, which has a great kind of website that goes through and parses the various kind of campaign finance websites and information and shows you exactly how much money different organizations give. Now, the other thing is what we would call, persuasive powers. And there's two ways to approach this. Traditionally, there was what was called inside lobbying. And what this constituted was, basically, I am a lobbyist. I might have been a former government employee. I know the ropes. I know the people. I have connections with them. I go in, sit down, and say, look, I'm working for organization X. Here's our agenda. We think that this is important public policy. These are the reasons why, and we're hoping that you can support us on this. Right? That's inside lobbying. In other words, I'm a lobbyist. I'm getting paid by somebody to go in and talk to a member of Congress and ask them to vote for something. However, given an expansion of the amount of interest groups in the last, say, 50 years or so, what's become very common is something called outside lobbying. And in order to cut through all the clutter in Washington, D.C., and all the different varieties of interest groups, what people of interest groups have tried to do is to coordinate their inside lobbying with outside lobbying. And the outside lobbying is essentially asking those people who are members of my group to directly contact members of Congress. And that can be via emails, via calls, via visits to district offices, whatever the case may be. And the goal of the outside lobbying is to show members of Congress that their constituents are very interested in a topic. And therefore, when I go in and make my pitch in the inside lobbying, people will sit up and take notice that, oh, yeah, I seem to be getting a lot of calls about this issue. Tell me more about this and tell me how it affects my district. So because of all the interest groups in Washington, D.C., this inside lobbying really is helped by outside lobbying. I'm getting people to lobby their members of Congress on an issue so that when I go in, they've already been softened up and they understand that this is an important issue. Now, one of the interesting things about interest groups is that we oftentimes think that they have perfect knowledge of how the system works and that they have all the information at their fingertips that they need. And all they have to do is pick up a phone and call somebody and something gets done. However, if you take a look at this chart here, what you'll really find is that throughout all of the information that's here is that there's a lot of uncertainty for interest groups. And you'll find that most of what they spend their days on as lobbyists is not whining and dining members of Congress like most Americans would think, but rather basically just finding out fundamental information of what's going on in Washington. Who in Congress are most likely to make some decisions on the issues that I'm interested in? What are they thinking about these issues? What other members of Congress might be opposing them or supporting them? What other interest groups are on my side or against me? So a lot of my time as a group representative is really spent just raising the profile of my organization and trying to find out what's going on in Washington. And, this kind of testimony or high-level kind of, whining and dining is something that's done relatively infrequently. Again, most of it's about finding information. Now, some of the problems with having strong interest groups have been discussed at another point in time. But the first one is political inequality. So not everyone has the ability or the money to be able to organize. And as a consequence of that, if we have a strong interest group system that does work on behalf of specific policy issues, we can't ensure that everybody actually has the same access to decision makers. So there is an inherent unfairness and a bias towards wealthier people within the context of a strong interest group system. The second thing is, oftentimes when we talk about the public good, interest groups are called special interests for a reason. They very narrowly focus on what's good for their clients at the expense of what might possibly be bad public policy for the rest of us. So when we talk about public policy influence, oftentimes the most effective people are those interest groups that are looking for their narrow, selfish, special interest at the expense of what's better for everyone else. So for that reason, a lot of people point to the interest group system as being detrimental to American democracy. And then finally, if you take a look at our kind of system of checks and balances and federalism, interest groups are most effective really in slowing down the process of passing public policy rather than actually getting something passed. So they're good at stopping things as opposed to being good at getting things passed. So there's an inherent kind of aspect of the interest group system that slows the process down. Now, one of the most interesting things is within the context of interest group theory, the question of who has the most power. And we just talked about the fact that, the interest group system is inherently biased against those who cannot organize. One of the prime theories that we look at when we study interest groups and their power within society is something we can call the privileged position of business. And this is named from a guy named Charles Lindblom. And if we take a look at two potential systems, what we see is that Lindblom said, we live in a capitalist economy, right? In the capitalist economy, the economic system is dominated by the market. In other words, individual firms determine what's going to be produced, how much it's going to cost, how they're going to distribute it, and where they're going to sell it, and all that kind of stuff. And property is privately owned in the capitalist system. Now, that's obviously different from socialism, where the economic system is essentially controlled by the government. So the government would determine, what's going to be produced, how it's going to be distributed, and how much it's going to cost. And under a socialist system, then, this means of production is government owned. So as you can see here, there would be a fundamental disconnect between the power of business in a socialist system, when the government owns all the businesses, versus a capitalist system where it's basically the individual firms that are making decisions. Now, why does this create a problem, or why does it create a privileged position of business? Well, essentially, here's the problem. Lindblom points to the fact that politicians have a kind of a dilemma, right? They don't really control the economy because that's up to individual firms who create jobs and raise wages and make people happy. However, guess who gets elected out of office if they don't have a good economy? It's those individual officials. We hold them responsible for a good economy. However, they really don't have it very much in their power to be able to control that economy. So that's the dilemma. So what we see is that politicians will be naturally predisposed towards thinking in terms of what business wants in order to create a good economy, so that they therefore can take credit when there is economic growth. And, basically government tries to anticipate what business wants by having, minimal regulation, by providing tax incentives to create jobs, and then by having a good kind of corollary system of other services that are provided to people, such as good education, protection of jobs overseas through military power, and so forth, right? So from Lindblom's perspective, politicians will naturally want to do what business wants because they want to get reelected. And that's the most important thing possible. The problem with this, as you can read in the David Hart article, is that business is rarely unified. So the idea that there is a quote-unquote business out there is the same as saying that the people want something, right? Businesses in general want a low-taxed economy with good services and good infrastructure. But beyond that, the specifics are very rarely ever present, and there's very rarely any unanimity among different organizations. Right? So when we talk about businesses, different businesses want different types of things. So, for example, back in the recession of 2007, 2008, you had, thinking just about financial firms alone, you had banks, credit unions, brokerage firms, and mortgage companies who all provided the same types of services and were regulated differently. And each one of these wanted something different out of the bailout package that was provided under the Bush administration. None of them could agree what was the best. Credit unions didn't need as much help, so they didn't want government interference. Brokerage firms were the ones that were selling bad mortgages, and they were the ones likely to go under, so they needed the most help, as were mortgage companies. So what we see is that when we talk about business, there is no such thing as a business interest. There are many different business interests. So this somewhat mitigates businesses' power over government, because other than the general business environment, all businesses turn into special interests when it comes to specific things that they want.